It's 12:01. I think it's time to get a start on this very exciting day for APSC JCS 2020 webinar. Thanks for all the participants who have dialed in since Monday on the 27th. And we will finish up on an exciting 1st August APSC convocation virtual ceremony. So stay tuned to that as well. Today, our starting session is the APSC JCS 2020 webinar on artificial intelligence in cardiology. A date stamp here is the 30th July, 12 noon Singapore time. This meeting is organized by APSC JCS, endorsed by Singapore Cardiac Society, the ICP, and sponsored by Philips. These are my esteemed panel of speakers as well as panelists, which I'll introduce one by one. So myself, I'm Jack, a cardiologist from Singapore, the current president of the Asian Pacific Society of Cardiology. Our speakers today are Prof. Javier Escaned, the head of interventional cardiologists in Clinical San Carlos, Spain. Professor Justin Davis, a senior research fellow, consultant cardiologist at the National Heart and Lung Institute, Imperial College, London. I'm sure you know him as the IFR guy. Associate Professor Khung Keong. He's my good colleague who does too many things. And he's also leading our research efforts in SingHealth Cluster Duke NUS Cardiovascular Science Academic Program. Dr. Jasper Tromp is our research fellow at National Heart Center, currently based in Holland. And he's going to talk to us about AI as well. Our panelists, we have Dr. Logan, who is currently doing his fellowship at Cornell University, previously under Dr. James Min, with interest in AI augmented vulnerable plug imaging on CT. Dr. Takayuki Warisawa is an interventional cardiologist who graduated from Tokyo University, currently doing his research postdoc fellowship at Imperial College London. So a disclaimer here, this content is copyrighted by APSC and should not be distributed without the prior permission of APSC. The views and opinions expressed in the webinar are those of the faculty's members alone and do not necessarily represent those of APSC. Housekeeping, the live streaming content of this webinar is made available via Rutherford Medicine, the APSC Facebook and YouTube page. And for Singapore registered physicians, CME point will be awarded to attendees who are active for at least 1 hour on this webinar. This webinar is also CME accredited by EBAC, which awards 1 CME point for attendee who attend a full session. You will receive your certificate of attendance upon completing a survey sent to you by email post-webinar. You can do your Q&A for participants down in the box below. We hope to make this session very interactive, so we want to focus more on the Q&A component to educate cardiologists like me whether I have a future in cardiology when AI takes over and or not. So I'm going to ask them tons of questions. Please help them by asking tons of questions as well. So quick announcement for the next session. The next session today will be an APSC consensus statement for the use of ticagrelor in Asia, rethinking the use of DAPT, implementing the latest evidence in antiplatelet regimes to clinical practice, where we have speakers like Roxana Moran, Gilles Mondelesco, Sydney Lowe speaking in that session. So I'd like to thank you again. I'm going to stop share and introduce my first speaker, who's going to talk about a very interesting topic. So the first section of talks, we are going to focus on the introduction to AI for the newbies in Asia. And the first 2 talks are combining empathy and AI, what it means for a better tomorrow. Sounds like a commercial. Delivered by Professor KK Yeo. The second talk will be AI in cardiology, the concepts, the tools, and the challenges. The horse is the one who runs, you must be the jockey. Delivered by Dr. Jasper Tromp. Then we'll break for a Q&A where I'd like to flesh out the basics of AI with our esteemed speakers and panelists, followed by 2 subsequent talks on practicalities of AI for cardiologists, both in daily practice as well as in the cath lab. So with that, I would like Professor Yeo to start his live lecture.
Um, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to APSC and to Jack. So this is a rather difficult talk for me to give, combining empathy and AI, what it means for better tomorrow. And to be honest, when I received the title, I struggled a little bit, and I hope I can address the questions intrinsic in this particular title. These are my disclosures. So what is artificial intelligence? It is a field of computer science that aims to mimic human thought processes, learning capacity, and knowledge storage. And in practical terms, AI is the ability of a machine or device to make autonomous decisions based on the data it collects. For medicine, this typically involves data such as health records or otherwise information extracted from images, and using them to predict a likely diagnosis, identify a new disease, or select a best choice of treatment. And essentially, these involve identifying key features, making correlations, interactions, classifying them, and learning from these classifications. And in brief, this means powerful, iterative pattern recognition, something that we take for granted as we grow up. Now, other industries are way ahead of medicine in terms of AI, whether it is your Amazon, eBay, Apple, Google, Tencent, Alibaba, whether it's your camera technology, whether it is weather prediction. Now that's a bit tough sometimes. Banking, finance, or even insurance. So in medicine, this is becoming more and more likely to happen. We have websites or articles that say that AI predicts heart attacks better than doctors. And in truth, if you look at these companies as shown on this slide, this is really an outdated slide from 1 or 2 years ago. This is now essentially going to be a big business in the medical as well as the tech industry. AI in healthcare is estimated to be a 20 billion business by the middle of the 2020s. And if you look at the business plan for startups, is just easy. You just take whatever you want and add the word AI or machine learning or something along those lines. In Singapore, we already have that in the marketplace. A company arising from the SingHealth Duke NUS Academic Medical Center has really deployed a AI platform for the diagnosis of diabetic eye disease. This platform called Selena is really been put in the market. Now, let's switch angles a little bit and talk about the other part of my question, and that is, what is empathy? Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And this is different from sympathy, in which you feel like what the other person is feeling. And sometimes those two words get confused. But here we're talking about empathy. And empathy is also described in these terms, especially in the medical world, the ability to understand a patient's situation, perspectives, feelings, and their attached meanings, and to communicate this back to the patient and act on these understandings. So I think the keyword here is understanding. And I put up this picture because I think it speaks for itself. If you see this picture, I think all of us recognize somebody who's had a bad time or is feeling down, and sort of a helping hand. And this conveys more than those words which I had used in the previous 2 slides, what empathy is. Empathy is a very human trait. Now, the problem is that empathy runs sometimes in counter direction to our other major trait in medicine, and that is the brain, where we analyze data. And if you talk about empathy, you think about things such as feeling safe, emotional connection, identifying the needs, collaborating with colleagues, creativity, negotiation. But the problem is that there's a trade-off between empathy and what we need to do as doctors. Imagine if you are a surgeon and you are making a cut in a woman's breast, and you're worried about how that person might feel about losing the breast, or if you are cutting into somebody's abdomen, taking out a cancer. If you are too empathetic and you start getting upset, you're not going to be able to do a good job. So for many of us, empathy and cognition or intellect run counter to each other in our daily work. So the truth is, between empathy and intellect or cognition, we must find a good balance. And this trade-off is what makes a good doctor. Of course, we're not talking about good doctors now, we're talking about AI, where it is very hard to demonstrate empathy, or so we think. I wonder how many of you remember the classic film Blade Runner, and I think this is one of those films that highlight the difficulties in this most human of emotions, or one of the most human emotions, and that is of empathy. Or Wall-E. Again, this, I don't know how Disney does it, but they can easily convey the sense that this robot here, which looks pretty beaten up, has perhaps a sense of humanity in those eyes. What about the HAL, the AI machine in the 2001 Space Odyssey? Of course, our favorite AI machine, Mr. Terminator, does he have empathy? We know from the subsequent Terminator films that he had developed a spark of humanity, and that is oftentimes suggested by these expressions of empathy. And for all of us, I think we want to demonstrate empathy, but perhaps not as shown in this cartoon. This picture here, which I grabbed from the internet, shows a doctor, and I would say that somehow or another, in this little cutout in that facial expression, you can sense a bit of empathy in him, and this is something that we want to see in our physicians. But the AI is really hard for that to be expressed, and maybe just to extract this. The one attribute that was always mentioned as necessary to being a good physician was being a good listener. Each patient wants to be treated as a person, not as an illness, and wants to be reassured that the doctor understands the non-medical aspects of his or her condition. So empathy can be described by these following words: kind, caring, listening, understanding, patient, as in patience with managing the individual, respecting choices, knowing how I feel, and caring for me. So these are words that come into empathy. So can AI with these restrictions and these constraints replace a doctor? I'm just going to highlight some areas where AI might be in play right now. Chatbots, backend algorithms, what does it mean to the patient? Financials, is it all about the money? Clinical care, is it good enough that the AI says that just remove this lump and the patient will be fine? How do we instill empathy into this relationship? I'm just going to show a few bits of some of these small videos which you probably would recognize. This chatbots are already in place, whether it is in Siri.
So I'm going to go ahead and activate Siri. How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? 42 cords of wood. Exactly. Everyone knows that.
So I mean, this is Siri, and this is of course a powerful AI engine running in the background, and we see that in our airline bookings, our internet hotel bookings, they are already in existence. Can this AI replace what we see in the clinic room today? I'm not sure. I've already previously shown this video. This is a China daily columnist, and it reminds me. This one I'll let it play a bit longer.
我是由新华社和搜狗公司联合培育的全球首个 AI 合成女主播。我的名字叫奚小芒，我的声音和外形脱胎于新华社新媒体中心新闻主播巨芒。
So, can I ask if you would like this person to be your doctor, and is this person able to display empathy that will be important for medical care? So, in the ideal state, these authors, Dr. Verghese, Harrington, and Shah, out of Stanford, has expressed the opinion that what this computer needs is a physician humanism and artificial intelligence. And perhaps the best way to think about it is that we need AI to augment clinical intelligence and call it augmented intelligence. The future, I think, has already arrived. We now have a ton of data. There are direct patient data in the living environment, whether it's the Fitbit or things that you wear. Traditional pharma device companies are already transforming themselves into AI companies, and we already have a ton of it in our lives, whether it is the hotel bookings or social media, directing the news that you want to read and hear into your Facebook or Twitter streams. And I think that as physicians, we should really adapt or go the way of, the dinosaur. Although I think this dinosaur is kind of big. We should ask questions about its role in medical care, and doctors really need to learn about AI and engage in your own destiny. Some recommendations: I think we should establish good governance on data use and AI. Physicians should be part of the solution and help regulate and govern responsible use of AI. And I think it is important to engage technology companies and other businesses that empathy and humanism needs to be grown into the DNA of artificial intelligence. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, KK. Thanks for keeping to time. So maybe we'll move on to Jasper's next lecture. Then we'll round up for Q&A after the first two talks. So Sam, can you share Jasper's lecture?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jasper Tromp. I'm a research fellow at the National Heart Center Singapore. And today it's my sincere pleasure to talk to you about AI in cardiology, concepts, tools, and challenges. So these are my take-home points for today. First of all, AI constitutes the computer mimicking intelligent human behavior. In machine learning, this is the case when there is no explicit programming by any human. Unsupervised machine learning algorithms can help in classifying patients into novel subgroups. Supervised machine algorithms can aid in the prediction of outcomes, for example, mortality, whereas deep learning algorithms are used primarily for imaging data and can both be helpful in supervised as well as unsupervised ways by predicting outcomes or classifying images. And lastly, machine learning algorithms are potentially limited by their generalizability, and the reproduction of algorithms can sometimes be poor. So what is artificial intelligence? First of all, artificial intelligence refers to the capability of computers to imitate intelligent human behavior. So how does this compare to machine learning? Well, machine learning is the field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without actually being explicitly programmed. So you can imagine that, for example, a clinical decision support system, which is often used in a lot of hospitals with explicit human programming, is actually a form of AI, but it's not a form of machine learning. Then lastly, there's the subfield of deep learning, which refers to deep artificial neural networks, which are mostly used for imaging data, where the word deep in this case refers to the many layers of the artificial neural network. So within machine learning, we distinguish two different types of algorithms. The first one are unsupervised machine learning algorithms. This type of algorithm only uses the input data and learns based on the data structure which of the data points belong together. So in other words, it will assume that when data points are close together, they will represent a certain class or subgroup. So to make this a little bit more clear, I'm showing you an example of a study we did, which was published in PLOS Medicine in 2018, where using comorbidities, we hypothesized that a machine learning algorithm could identify patient subgroups with distinct multi-morbidity profiles. So we did two things here. First of all, we use the comorbidities as the input for a clustering algorithm. Secondly, the clustering algorithm will actually then do two things. Namely, first, it will determine the optimal number of subgroups. And secondly, it will determine which patient belongs to which subgroup. So in our paper, we found 5 different subgroups defined by the machine learning algorithm in about 6,400 patients with heart failure. In this case, 3 of these subgroups were more likely to have heart failure with a preserved ejection fraction, which refers to also increased filling pressures. In this case, patients who were mostly older with a high prevalence of AF, patients with obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, and a unique lean diabetic subtype, which were patients who had basically no obesity, but in all cases almost had diabetes. All these patients were more likely to have HFpEF, and importantly, our lean diabetic patients had actually the worst clinical outcomes. So in other words, these unsupervised algorithms can identify new data structures and subgroups in your patient population, which might actually already be there in the data, which can then also have clinically meaningful implications. So then there's also a supervised algorithm. So supervised algorithms are more similar to how a child learns that 2 + 2 is 4. So in this case, you provide the computer with both the input data, so the 2 + 2, as well as the output vector, which in this case would be 4. And then based on the input data, it will try to predict the output. Subsequently, the algorithm will try to then predict the output based on input data, which is unlabeled. So in other words, you can use this to predict mortality based on other factors like age, sex, or comorbidities. And in this paper, published in PLOS Medicine and done by researchers from the Albert in Australia, the authors used clinical characteristics from patients with an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest to predict in-hospital mortality. And the authors found that using an ensemble model, which is a combination of different machine learning models, the algorithm was better able to predict in-hospital mortality than clinical models, which are also used to predict in-hospital mortality for this patient population. Lastly, there are deep learning models. So deep learning models are based on artificial neural network. Artificial neural networks in architecture mimic the human brains and how neurons are connected. These algorithms can be both unsupervised as well as supervised within the application of machine learning data, and especially with imaging data, the use is most often supervised. The unique ability of these algorithms is the possibility to convert imaging data into abstract data points, which can then feed into these mathematical formulas. An example of the use of this algorithm was provided in this paper from colleagues in Yale. And in this case, the authors trained a deep learning algorithm on 267 echo examinations to recognize different views on echoes. And the authors were able to train an algorithm with an accuracy of at least 97% for each individual view to identify 15 distinct views. The authors then compared their algorithm to trained sonographers. And they found that compared to trained sonographers, the algorithm for videos in blue and still images in light blue was better able to predict the correct view compared to trained human sonographers, which is here in white. Furthermore, in this paper from the University of San Francisco, published in Circulation 2018, the authors used deep learning algorithms to automatically annotate still images on echo. So here on the left, you see the original echo image, while in the middle, you see the original annotation done by a sonographer. On the right, you see the predicted annotations by the deep learning algorithm. And as you can see, the predicted annotation is almost similar to the original annotation by the sonographer. So in other words, deep learning algorithms can also be used to annotate images. Then using these annotations, the authors were also able to calculate different volumes of the left ventricle, the atria, but also the left ventricular ejection fraction. And here you see three Bland-Altman plots where on the y-axis, you see the difference between the automated measurement versus the manual measurement. And then the x-axis, you see the mean of the actual measurement provided by the algorithm. And you see that generally the overall differences between the automated and the manual measurements were relatively small for both the left ventricular diastolic volume, the left atrial volume, and even for the left ventricular ejection fraction. Lastly, the authors used a machine learning algorithm to automatically diagnose hypertrophic cardiomyopathy based on echo images alone, as well as amyloid disease. And the authors found that a machine learning algorithm based on still images were able to identify a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with an AUC of 0.93 and amyloid with an AUC of 0.87, which is considered to be reasonably high and close to clinical applicability. So we've seen that machine learning algorithms can be used to predict future events. They can be used to classify patients into distinct subgroups, which might provide new hypotheses. And we've seen how machine learning algorithms can be used to annotate images, as well as calculate volumes, and maybe even establish diagnoses. But machine learning algorithms are not a panacea, and there are a number of important challenges. First of all, you will never be better than your golden standard. This means that if you have poor data to train on, the algorithm will perform poorly in other data sets, which some have said is causing a scientific crisis. Secondly, when the training data has poor representation of different ethnicities as well as different sexes, it might actually perform very poorly in patients who are not represented in your training data. So an algorithm trained in Indian patients might not perform as well in Chinese patients. Thirdly, there might be model overfit. And this refers to the concept of generalizability, where a model that has a good performance will basically be able to predict the outcome based on a new problem that it's presented, whereas a poor model, which is overfitted, will actually learn the answers by heart from the training data and will thus be unable to predict new outcomes based on problems that it's never seen before. Lastly, an important concept is the concept of explainability. Explainability is of critical importance, especially in a clinical setting, because if a machine learning model is unable to show how it came to a certain decision, a doctor or nurse might actually not trust the answer that the machine learning model is providing. So this is a relatively hot area, a new area in machine learning, which will see a lot of things happening in the coming years. So with this, I'd like to go back to my take-home point. So AI refers to the computer mimicking intelligent human behavior, whereas machine learning refers to a version of AI where this happens without explicit human programming. Unsupervised machine learning algorithms can be used to classify patients into subgroups, which can provide new hypotheses. Supervised machine learning algorithms can be used to predict outcomes or labels of patients or establish diagnoses. Deep learning algorithms are specifically used for imaging data, and it's also in this type of algorithms that we've seen the most progress in the last few years, and we are close to clinical applicability. And lastly, machine learning algorithms are limited by their generalizability, as well as an oftentimes poor reproduction in other data sets. And with that, I'd like to thank you for attending my talk.
And I would like to just take a pause here. So this is just a quick and dirty introduction to AI for cardiologists. And I'd like to just refresh on the things I heard in the first two lectures. So in the first lecture on empathy and the general introduction on AI by Jasper, it seems to me that maybe machine learning is not quite there in connecting with the empathy. It still doesn't quite seem to have the intuition to do major switches. What we figure as our intuition or clinical gestalt is not quite there. It's not inputted as a data point But of course, there are advantages. Human beings probably can't take so many data points in, and therefore, in terms of seeing pattern, it's probably much better. I would like to maybe ask our panelists first. You are the new generation of cardiologists. Both of you are research doctoral fellow, one in Cornell, one in Imperial, focusing on AI, imaging, and application, either in the cath lab or in CT scanners. Is that what all cardiologists should be interested in now? Logan, maybe we'll start with you.
Thanks, Jack. And first, excellent talk by KK on the importance of empathy and the humanity of it. And equally important, I think, was Jasper's not just introduction to machine learning and AI, but also, as important, the shortfalls of AI and the flaws and the pitfalls that we could fall into, which I think we've all encountered, I think, in our work here. So I think it is something that we should be interested in, but we should not be overly fascinated or think of it as a panacea and a cure-all for everything. It is promising. We've seen not just in the medical field, but literally everywhere else, including with financial analytics, weather prediction, as you mentioned, AI this, AI that, and slapping on AI or machine learning onto any topic doesn't mean it's a cure-all and it's a solution. I think what the clinician needs to understand is that it is a tool. So your everyday lay clinician, so to speak, who's dealing with the patient, just needs to understand that AI is a tool. AI is a tool just like using the Framingham risk score is a risk prediction tool. Just like using, your STS score is a tool. So it's a tool to help you understand better or comprehend a few things, condense it, and to make a clinical decision based on that. In fact, I would argue that the revolution in AI is similar to one with evidence-based medicine, 30, 40 years ago. Previously, we used to treat things based on, first principles, and we used to base it on anecdotal evidence. And then we started saying, no, we need randomized controlled trials. We needed evidence-based medicine, gathering these larger amounts of data and seeing whether it will work. And sometimes we found certain trials and certain therapeutics and certain interventions didn't work as well as we hoped it did. And we've seen that with certain interventions. So similarly, we're using AI as a tool to say, hey, this conventional wisdom, all these things that we thought were right, are they right? Do they make sense? But we also have to understand, just like evidence-based medicine, there are people or cases where there are exceptions to the rule. Evidence-based medicine and the study and the statistical analysis of that can also be flawed. So I think the average clinician just needs to know, yes, it is a tool. We are starting to apply it to a few things that will hopefully help us understand things better, but we still need to question it, as Jasper has pointed out.
Thanks, Logan. Dr. Warisawa, can I just ask you, is AI a big thing in Japan now? And I know you're in Imperial College doing AI, and we saw that AI seems to be more closer in terms of pattern recognition, imaging, pathology side, radiology. What is your take on AI for Japan now?
Thank you. First, I have to confess, I personally am not an AI researcher or AI dedicated doctor. Actually, I'm very analog style Japanese traditional doctor. So, and also I've come back from Imperial College London to Japan, Yokohama City. Now I'm working as a very old fashioned traditional Japanese style. So, in my personal opinion, even me, like analog man, have to learn more and more from AI stuff things. Because as you know, the AI can definitely improve the quality of a medical service, I believe. So we have to learn, but for us, I mean, for the person who is not a specialist of this field, cannot understand what is the good point, I mean, advantage of this technology, and what is the disadvantage, I mean, the pitfall of this technology. So I think I want to ask the AI professional researcher to clearize what is the benefit and what is the pitfall of this technology. So currently, for Japanese cardiologist or Japanese doctor, maybe I think most of the doctors are interested in AI stuff. However, they cannot understand, or they don't want to understand, or they don't want to learn more. They don't want to consume a lot of time to understand that, because very, very uncertain things. AI is very, very uncertain things for us, like us, a very mature AI researcher or AI, not AI doctor. So I think learning is important, but we don't know what is the learning point. That is the problem, I believe, in Japan. So in summary, I think in Japanese medical condition, most of the doctor wants to know, but they don't know what they should know.
So thanks, Warisawa. What you said is not peculiar to Japan. Actually, most countries are the same. And you're talking about, but I would say AI is not a unknown. It's probably a known unknown for most of us. Justin, what's your take? How should the young cardiologists of tomorrow look at AI, and should all cardiologists like me learn AI, big data, analytics?
Well, firstly, Jack, and thanks to all the organisers for putting this on. And I can tell you one thing, having had Dr. Warisawa in our lab in Imperial for a couple of years, he definitely is not an ordinary doctor. He's a very special researcher and doctor, and he knows a lot about AI as well. He's very modest as well. So, but I think that we shouldn't underestimate the impact this is going to have in healthcare going forward. I think a great analogy to this is that would you feel very safe getting onto an aeroplane without the help and support of the computer systems for autopilot and for all the other safety systems on board? You know, would you like to have a pilot flying the plane all night by hand? The answer is no. It'll be a very bumpy ride for most of us. And I think therein lies probably the answer to many of these questions, is that AI, I suspect, will infiltrate all aspects of all care throughout medicine. I think it's going to be one which always challenges us, and it's going to say, hey, this is what I think the diagnosis is, and it's going to ask us to say, is this the case, just like with pilots. And I think it's probably going to improve the overall standards of healthcare by at least alerting us to possibilities of what a diagnosis could be. I agree entirely with the great first talk there, which was looking at empathy. And, you know, like, if you're ever on the other side of things, and as doctors, we tend to be on the treatment, you know, with giving the treatment rather than taking it, but you feel, you know, very vulnerable as a patient, and having that human connection is really, really important. And I think to discuss and to convey that information is something which we should never lose. But, you know, if we can use these tools to improve the quality of our care, then I think it's a win-win for all.
Yeah, I get that. It's like I turn on the Google map, you ask me to turn left, I turn left. I don't question whether I'm turning right. But the problem with medicine is that I feel that I should turn right. AI tells me to turn left. What do you do in that case? I mean, are you saying AI is 90% right, and I may have an off chance of 10% being better than AI, but am I turning left or right?
Jack, I think that's an optimal situation, because in reality, you as an expert practitioner may be beating it by 10%. But in reality, and if you talk to Manesh Patel and other people, you know, in terms of the appropriate use criteria guidelines in the US, one of the main problems is dragging the average standard of medical care up throughout the world. And, you know, we just have to look at our field of coronary intervention. And, you know, there's so much data there that stable coronary artery disease, we have to be very careful what we do. We've seen the Schema trial, we've seen Courage, you've seen Orbiter, all of which show if you use an angiogram to guide therapy, the results are no better than medical therapy. We've used physiology, they are better. That's an example. But people still choose to use the angiogram. So if the computer tells them one thing and they choose to do another, which is non-evidence-based, I think this is going to push us more in the way of evidence, and I think it's probably going to lead to better overall outcomes. And it may be difficult for people at times because, you know, there are other interests in which we face every day, whether from the hospital administrators or anything, to do certain things which may not always fit strictly in with the guidelines. And I think that's where the challenge will come as well from us at a personal level as physicians.
So KK, your empathy lecture was great. Doesn't mean the doctor just have to smile, look warm, hold the patient's hand, and listen to what AI does. So AI does the decision making, doctor does a hand holding. Is that the future for physicians in your mind, or is AI able to replicate showing a beautiful lady with all the emotions on the face, able to replicate telemedicine, AI, empathy, and everything else, and it's on demand. I won't be able to wake up at 3 a.m., but maybe the AI doctor can. So, KK?
So I think there are two levels of questions there. One is, do we still need the human touch? And I think the answer is yes. And I think as we evolve the power and the accuracy of artificial intelligence, we will reach a level where we are going to rely a little bit less on certain parts of our traditional training, such as rote learning and memory, and instead use them on demand. For example, do I need to know all the 10 trials on IFR? I don't need to. I know that if I needed to decide whether this particular lesion should be assessed by IFR, I can generate and synthesize that information with artificial intelligence and then make a decision as to where to use it. But I might need the humanism to talk to the patient and say, hey, look, I know you're having chest pain, but these results suggest that it's probably not due to coronary artery disease, and maybe we should explore something else. And that's where the humanism and the humanity comes in. So I think, I don't think it's a or B. I think it is A and B kind of scenario. Now, waking up at 3 a.m. has never been a favorite activity of mine. So I would definitely defer to a chatbot that can help serve some of these functions. But again, it is also an A and B situation, because if a patient calls at 3 a.m. for a problem, there are two types of problems, right? One is when something is seriously wrong, in which you might still need a human to say, you know what, go to the cath, go to the A&E. Or it might be something that that you don't need a doctor to do, or I really need a prescription for a morning after pill now. So, okay, well, you don't need a doctor. The AI machine can just perhaps get that prescribed straight away. So I think, again, it's an A and B situation. I think there will be times where a chatbot or similar platforms can help serve a particular need that is not, that doesn't require the human, direct human interaction. In fact, if you ask me, the morning after pill for those kind of scenarios may be better done by a chatbot. So I would say that it is a case-specific use for artificial intelligence.
So maybe we take two last questions before moving on to Justin's lecture on practicalities of AI now. So maybe I'll get Jasper to answer me these two questions. The AI system, are the system or software for free use? Is it a freeware? Who is going to pay for this system that you developed? What's the monetary model? Second question, is there a new label case of unsupervised machine learning developed clinically meaningful diagnostic value in our real life? So maybe Justin can take that one from Joseph Park. So Jasper, how do you monetize AI system? Who's going to pay for it? Is it the government? Is it the end user?
Yeah, I think, well, thanks a lot for the question. I think, well, depends on the company. There's a lot of startups doing AI now. There's bigger companies like the sponsor of the current session, Philips, GE, who are in AI. And I think in the future, definitely for imaging, in the near future, it will simply be part of the software package. So at the end of the day, depending on where you practice, it will be either the government or the hospital footing the bill. I'd like to just also briefly get back to a point that KK touched upon, because what I think and what is critical with AI is that we'll probably see in the near future that AI will take over repetitive tasks, like, for example, annotation of images, which are now still being done by either the cardiologist or the registrar. And I think, in a way, rather than expecting the AI to have empathy, I think it'll sort of free up the practicing physician to have more time for his or her patient to actually bring that human touch. And I think that's going to be the strength of AI, not necessarily to take over sort of the empathy, but actually to sort of support the physician in being able to, have that connection with the patient.
So KK, do you have any thoughts on the first question? Is like you say, SNC model for AI diagnostic for retinal imaging reading is already there and commercially validated for use. That's one commercial model. Anyone has any other commercial model out there that you know of?
AI, in terms of its commercial models, actually there are many ways to benefit for it, both as at an institutional, at a commercial, and at a national societal level. I mean, for example, in many places outside of Singapore where access to medical care is restricted by travel cost and transport systems, AI allowing chatbots to help triage patients are good examples where societies may want to pay for such services because it can deliver healthcare at a much more affordable cost to segments of the population. Say, for example, diagnostic tools where you can read, say, chest X-rays in screening algorithms. Certainly, if you can pre-read X-rays or help augment the radiologist's detection for abnormalities, that is already something that people will pay for. And I would suspect that companies like, say, Philips or GE or others would incorporate this so that they can market and sell their products as being more efficient with the underlying AI engines to make a better diagnosis and to improve workflow. So I think it will be there. Now, specific AI companies that do it for pure more AI than imaging, for example, they do exist too. For example, in the recent COVID outbreak, there are companies that use AI to help with vital signs monitoring to identify patients who are more likely to deteriorate while they are in the community. So that was deployed, I think, both in Germany and England, in various parts and other parts of the world as well. So these are all possibilities.
Thanks, Kiki. I think it's a great segue to move on to the next segment where we talk about practicalities. I know next time maybe you buy a cath lab from Philips, it must come on with an AI package that helps you guide what to do after a short angiogram and be more evidence-based in terms of decision tree. So we'd like to welcome Justin to give his talk on AI-assisted cardiologists in terms of workflow diagnosis algorithm versus expert human interpretation of the IFR, for example, pullback data. So maybe a bit more practical now, a switch to just general to specific. What is out there now? Justin is going to discuss with us some of the practicalities of AI usage in the cath lab. Justin, please.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to show you a few examples. I'm going to show you some of the research, which indeed Dr. Warasar was involved with at his time in London as well. In terms of these are algorithms which we've developed, which I think have direct, clinical implication in the field which we work in coronary physiology. So let me just ask this big question. I think we've spoken a little bit about this. I'm going to give you a slightly different answer here, which extends what we've known already. So why artificial intelligence? Well, I think that one of the things which we should always be alerted to with regards to anything we do in medicine, certainly in the cath lab for coronary physiology perspective, is if we're measuring stuff and we're measuring junk and it's garbage, the measurements we're taking, then the interpretation is going to be poor. So that could be an X-ray image where you're moving, it could be making a lousy physiology measurement, and it's sometimes very tricky in the midst of everything else going on in the cath lab, for example, to know exactly what's happening and to identify whether your measurement's good quality or not. And this is probably highlighted to me most by a paper where Alan Jeremiah's put in behalf of the CRF core lab from the contrast study. Now, these were not average investigators; these were the guys who defined FFR. And 30% of their data in the contrast study had to be removed because it was suboptimal quality. Drift, artifact, damping, you name it, they're the factors. So if this was an expert group, what about the rest of us in terms of, are we missing things which could lead to inaccurate interpretations? So really using AI, I'm going to show you a few different things here. Looking at signal stability, quality of signals, radiophysiology measurements, looking for, can we be safe to interpret the data we see in front of us, to then more complex pattern interpretation using pattern recognitions, matching them against larger data set interpretations, and ultimately to outcomes to see how we can help guide and simplify revascularization. Show you a case to start off with. So this is a case I did a few years back now. intermediate lesion in this mid-LAD. It's part of a research program. We measured here using FFR, intravenous infusion, 140 mics per kilogram per minute. Wire was placed distally, and you can see the peak drop in FFR was 0.86. As we always do in our lab, we bring the wire back at the end of the case. We check to make sure there's no pressure drift. We've got 0.98. So are we done? We're finished? Well, actually, no, because the people are very astute and looking at these curves will recognize there's a problem with this curve. It's very damped. And when we drew the wire back a couple of millimeters, we saw what was a more normal textbook pressure waveform. So we can't trust this measurement, but I didn't spot it during the case. I remeasured, and that 0.86 now became 0.73. Now, most interestingly to me as a researcher, and someone who's very interested in this, the same thing happened again. So what had happened before is the catheter got sucked into the coronary artery and caused dampening. Now, if you look at this curve here, you may not even be able to see it now, and I'm highlighting this to you. And I'm going to expand this area and show you there's two beats, the first two, where the catheter got sucked in with deep engagement. See loss of the aortic notch, and you can see the ventricularization of the waveform. Obvious now. I pulled it back by a millimeter. Now we've got a nice notch, and we've got a normal diastolic decline. When we normalized at the end of this case, you can see now that the catheter was out, everything was good. Now, as I said, this happens a lot, 30% of the time for experts. So we thought, can we develop a system which will help prevent it and actually mean that cardiologists don't need to worry about this as a problem, because the computer can say, hey, that data's good, or hey, there's a problem, you need to fix something. So we developed a comprehensive data set to do this, large data sets. We had to do a few things. Firstly, teach the systems what a beat was. Now that may seem obvious, but our eyes are very programmed to see beats in different ways. Then we need to teach it about different kind of beats, what's damped, what's artifact, you know, what can you trust, what can you not trust, and then bring it all together in a system. Very, very labor intensive process this, loads of data points, loads of beats all analyzed. This is an example of how you train the system to recognize what a beat is. These beats all look obvious, but now you'll see a beat which looks a bit weird. We know that's the start and stop of a heartbeat, but the computer may not recognize that. So the first thing we had to do is that. The next thing we had to do was to go through these thousands and thousands of beats and effectively characterize them all in different ways. So if they're normal, whether there's damp, there's artifact, whether it's noisy, ventricularized, whether the port was open, so on. So we did this to all our data sets. And then we put this into a mathematical model, built these neural networks. And then the next thing we do is to test it on an entirely different data set. And we did this with two different core labs. One was at Imperial as well, and one was external at the AMC. And so this is data which shows you from the AMC. So this is from the internal core lab, but the data from the AMC is identical. And it shows you the accuracy level if we compare the core lab adjudicated data is over 99%. The ability of the computer algorithms to detect normal beats is near 100%. And when you start to look at damp beats, 100%, and even beats which are starting to look a bit damp. So this is ones where you're starting to lose the dichrotic notch. It's again nearly 100% as well. So this has potential really to transform practice, to simplify it. This is how the system looks in working practice. If you look, we complicate things because you've got a red aortic signal on top of the yellow pressure wire signal. The computer's saying this is damped. It's hard to see. You've got two traces superimposed upon one another. But you'll see in a second how powerful the computer can be. It's saying there's artifact. It's now saying the port's open. Maybe you're injecting some heparin or saline into the vessel. It's giving you feedback all the time in real time, saying what's going on. And this is very, very useful when we're not so used to making these measurements, and we want to make sure we have the very highest quality. Now the port's open again. Now all of a sudden it will say to you that everything looks good, and I just want you to compare these two beats. This beat looked okay to start off with, but you can see now it's significantly damped. The computer could detect this without reference to a normal beat. So it's really very smart. And it could say, hey, don't measure here, but now you're safe to measure there. So this is potentially very transformative and to improve the quality of our analysis. And this was published relatively recently in, I think, JACC Cardiovascular Interventions. So next thing we're looking at is to go a little bit further than that. So now you've got the pressure wire down, you're doing these pressure wire pullbacks. Some of these interpretations can be complex. How do you apply all the rules? How do you apply the findings we've got from the clinical trials to improve your outcomes and to ensure we do the best patient care? So this is what we call intelligent pullback analysis. To give you some frame here, this is an IFR co-registration image. If you haven't seen this, this is performed by doing a pressure wire pullback down the length of the artery. Then the computer records the pressure IFR values at each location, and it matches that against the angiogram image. One yellow dot represents 1 unit of IFR. Lots represent a big drop. So here you can see that big collection of dots near the ostium of the LAD corresponds to a 25-unit drop. So there are bits here we want to treat, focal areas, and more diffuse areas we perhaps want to leave alone. Now, this has been recognized as one of these very, very important areas here. Here you see an expert commentary from Mort Kern and Arnold Cito talking about the potential to transform the way we perform physiology and PCI by using physiology not only to give us vessel level ischemic judgment, but also lesion level ischemic judgment. And we know this is important. We know from defined PCI, a study of nearly 500 patients, that in a quarter of patients at the end of the case, when a blinded physiology measurement was done after the operator said he had finished performing PCI, there was still evidence of residual ischemia. And perhaps most worrying of all is that in 80% of those cases, there was a focal lesion left untreated. So this is potential to, again, transform the way we perform PCI. And if you look at the ischemia study, well, who knows what the results would have been if instead of saying, hey, this guy's got a nuclear scan which is positive, and then coming into the cath lab and the cardiologist treating any artery based on the angiogram, if we'd been more like Syntex 2 or FAME and pinpointed which artery and then looking at which lesion to treat, maybe the results would have been very different. Now, how do we conventionally make difficult decisions in medicine? Well, we have a heart team approach. You know, these are things which we treat routinely, and discuss routinely: PCI versus CABG, TAVI versus AVR, EP ablation versus medical therapy, transplant suitability. You know it, you're involved with it, and we're all having to make decisions in this proper way. Now, I'll give you this example of how we can potentially help make these decisions, not necessarily every time with the heart team on its own, but also with the computer to support these decisions. Here's a pressure wire pullback. To perform this, the wire is positioned in the distal part of the artery. You pull back slowly at 1 to 2 millimeters per second, and you get a curve. And whether you get these big step ups, like here, is where there's a significant stenosis which potentially could benefit from treatment. But there are many different areas that different people may want to treat here. You may want to treat that zone, or perhaps go longer and treat that zone. So what we did is essentially we firstly developed algorithms to detect and to train the distal IFR measurements. We looked to ensure there wasn't any pressure wire drift, as I've shown you that before. We then identified what patterns of disease were, and we used this based on a huge database that we collected, and I'll describe that shortly, to define what the optimal PCI strategy was. So we had over 1,000 IFR pullback traces, and what the investigators didn't know in the study, around 300 of these were duplicates, so they were showing them twice. But they were never allowed to go back to essentially give an opinion of what they first decided to start off with. So essentially we were testing their reproducibility. We then asked 15 consultant experts in physiology and PCI from all around the world, huge contribution from Japan, Spain, Canada, UK, and the US, to interpret all of these pressure wire pullback curves on an online interface where they had to mark on the zone they would treat and say if it was appropriate to treat this patient. So loads of data points, over 30,000 expert interpretations. Then the computer ran the analysis using the algorithms. The computer had never seen this data set, so it was completely a new data set we tested. Here's the group of investigators, so really grateful to this team. And I'll give you an example of this is how it worked. So this was the real data from one patient. You see on the top the pullback curve. They all presented that. They didn't have access to any of the other graded data, and they just had to mark where they would treat. So for instance, grader 1 wanted to treat from here to here. This grader here, grader 3, wanted to treat a shorter segment. And essentially what we did is we looked at the consensus decision on the median there and then tested that against the computer. In this case here, you can clearly see it agreed. And we know from the model here, if you treated that zone, the IFR delta would be 0.06. And at the end of the case, the IFR, if you were successful with stenting, would rise to 0.95. So very helpful. Here's another case where there was general agreement that this was a diffuse lesion which perhaps wouldn't benefit from treatment, and the consensus from the humans was not appropriate for PCI, and same for the computer. So leave it alone. That was the consensus. So let's have a look at this now in terms of how accurate the computer is compared to the humans, and look at the variability. And also look at the cases where the computer, let's put inverted commas, gets it wrong in comparison to the humans, and see if this could be helpful rather than a hindrance. So let's look here. First of all, the appropriateness for PCI. So this is saying, does this number fall below the cut point? Is there any drift, which could mean that this measurement is invalid, and so on and so forth. So the median expert interpretation here was around 90%, and it was very, very similar for the computer interpretation, the ability to say this with confidence. Now look at the PCI strategy. So this is which bit of that physiology curve should we be treating? Again, it's around 90% with the human interpretation in terms of agreement with the median, and the computer is again around 90%. So clearly it's non-inferior. There's no difference here between these two. If we look at the reproducibility, this is where we do seem to start to see differences. So believe it or not, humans change their mind as a group, collectively, 15 experts, 1 in 10 times, whether the patient's appropriate for PCI or not in this 300 cases of reproducibility testing. And a smaller amount of variability between the group as a whole to the areas they would treat, about 10%. But of course, the computer never changed its mind or its strategy. So the big question here is, why isn't the computer 100% right? You know, what's happening? Because remember, the computer is using the expert group as its measure of rightness. And this question of gold standard, we're also using a human reference group. But is that the right thing? And when the computer disagrees, is it right or is it wrong? Well, here are a few cases. So here's a pressure wire pullback. Have a look at this yourself. I want you to tell me whether you think this is suitable for treatment. Well, certainly our experts here, the consensus was it should be treated. But the computer said it wasn't as appropriate for PCI. So what's happened? Is the computer right, or are the experts right? Have a look here. What the computer had seen is that there was significant amount of drift in this case. And you could see, rather than the wire coming back to 1 as it should at the end of the case, it was well below that. And the effect this was having was to offset this curve below the treatment threshold significantly. When this was corrected, it means that the IFR was no longer significant, and as a result, this patient, according to the clinical trial data, potentially may not benefit from treatment. Now, it's amazing if you think almost all of these experts failed to identify this when they were pressured to do lots of cases over a short period of time, which is a pretty good example of real-world practice. And where the computer disagreed with the humans, this happened in around 4% of cases, exactly similar to this, where humans had missed something like pressure wire drift. Coming to the end here now, and I'll just show you another case where the humans effectively differed from the machine. And here's another case. You know, what do you do here? Well, again, you know, there's clear disagreement here between human judgment, between themselves. You know, you've got this, some say treat, some say don't treat, and the overall consensus is not appropriate for PCI. But the computer thinks it is appropriate for PCI. Now, one of the reasons the computer thought that this was not appropriate for PCI is because they think it's above this threshold. The value here is 0.90, which of course, as you know from the trials, shouldn't be treating. But again, the computers looked a little bit more deeply here and said, hey, if we account for some drift on this wire, this is actually a very significant lesion which we should be treating. Now, believe it or not, this accounts for 30% of the discordance between humans and computer. So I put it out there, you know, we've used the humans here as the best we've got as a reference gold standard. But people are missing things on occasions which potentially could lead to the treatment strategies being altered, which don't necessarily follow what we know from the clinical trials would give us the best possible results. So an overview of this really in terms of looking at human interpretation, algorithmic interpretation, looking at the degrees of variability, the chances for mismatch, where they occur, and the levels of reproducibility. And I think that this gives us a very strong case, at least in support of the algorithms, to at least challenge the physicians in their clinical decision-making in the cath lab. Again, this data was published in JACC Cardiovascular Intervention as well. So just really to conclude here, where are we going with all this? Because I think this is really the very interesting area of research. And I think I give Phillips a huge amount of credit here, really push forward this field from FFR to the IFR Scout, co-registration, now really into this area of using co-registration to guide therapy. And this study, the Defined GPS study, a study which will start later this year, which is using this IFR co-registration as our metric for where we should be treating, give the physicians that advice, And in a FAME1-like study, comparing that to patients who just have a physiological significant lesion in artery where they don't use pressure wire pullbacks and don't use this extra data. So head-to-head comparison, large global multi-center study will start later this year. And I think this is fascinating, very interesting, especially in the afterfall of the ischemia trial and orbiter trial. So, we should be really using at least vessel level ischemia. And I think moving towards lesion level ischemia, especially as patients get more complex, more diffuse disease, knowing what we can treat and what we should be treating, but what we should be leaving alone is going to be increasingly important. So just really to summarize here, that we know that this intelligent pullback system gives us an expert eye for all IFR scout recordings. This is just giving you an interpretation. At very least, it's going to challenge us to think, hey, why is the computer saying something different from what I think? It gives you a heart team decision, a consensus defensibility on every single measurement. And of course, the appropriate, because it's following those rules and those guidelines, means that you're never going to fall short of a rule or a guideline or insurance company requirement for reimbursement. And it's very supportive, I think, to human decision making. And so overall, my conclusions here, AI, as we've heard from this super webinar, is becoming increasingly important in healthcare. I think previously AI's had a role in static image processing. I think that's starting to evolve, as we've seen with some of the echo image interpretation, and clearly here with this physiology data. And I think dynamic decision making online, real time in the cath lab, which of course these tools really give us the ability to do, is going to really help us improve patient care and improve quality of care, and make sure that us as practitioners are really protected and give our patients the best in the cath lab. Jack, I'll hand back to you for the rest of the webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Justin. That was terrific about the practicalities in the cath lab. We welcome Prof. Javier Escaned from Spain. Thank you for joining us. Prof, do you mind if we get you to give your lecture live? Because time is running out, I was wondering whether you can share your slide and then we can maybe keep it to 12 minutes, closer to 12 minutes, so we have more time for Q&A. While you're preparing for your slide share, I'm just going to ask Justin about our favorite question, money. How is what your good work you've done in the cath lab translatable in terms of financial? Should every device be packaged with this AI? Does Philip pay for it? Do I pay for it? And how are researchers and institutions like Imperial benefiting from this piece?
So I think it's a great question, Jack. I think probably it's going to differ from every market around the world. I think in the US the case will be much simpler than elsewhere. If you can show that you have an improved quality, improved standards, improved allegiance with the appropriate use criteria, and then ultimately improved guidelines by using the algorithms, I think the insurance companies will pay for it. They'll pay for the use of these algorithms. I think the other thing as well is if we can show that it makes practice safer, again, insurance companies will pay for it, because it means that physicians are performing safer practice, which leads to less insurance claims and better overall outcomes for patients as well. So I think that's definitely one bucket, and I think that would be financed in a way that it's very, very supportive of improved quality of care, improved overall standards, and improved safety. So I think those are things which I think there'll be probably reimbursement codes grow from that. I think other ways which could be assisted, I'm sure that companies will use these as differentiating features, whether they're paid for or not, whether they're individual case-based click-through procedures, or whether there's a subscription to hospitals where they can use these in bundles. It could well be a company like Philips, whereby you've got access to CT all the way through to pressure wise, that, for instance, we're paying for a patient's care in terms of if they come into the clinic and have a CT scan, all the way to the diagnostic modalities to the end of the journey. And that could mean bundling in angio-FFR, angio-IFR, using AI-based systems as a kind of whole diagnostic suite which a hospital buys into. So I think you've got to just think a multi-level here, both in terms of reimbursement, but also strategically where companies may position it, and also where it may be very attractive for hospitals in terms of taking on those bundles which may be more cost effective for them. So
it's like extra features, Maserati versus a Toyota, maybe a GE lab versus a Philips lab in the future. So Prof, welcome again. I was wondering whether we can have you share your slides and present live, so we can truncate it maybe 12 minutes So we can ask you in the last 10 minutes more questions. Yeah, Prof.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's a great pleasure, and thank you for the invitation to be in this webinar of the Asian Pacific Society of Cardiology. I think that you're probably seeing my slides. Again, I mean, obviously we are in a webinar that is talking about artificial intelligence, and the role of this presentation will be to try to provide a glimpse on how this can interact or be enriching our practice in the cath lab. Now, one of the aspects of terminology, of course, I think is clear for all of us, but within the wider field of artificial intelligence, we have systems like the ones that were shown to us by Dr. Justin Davis a few minutes ago, which are the machine learning algorithms, whose performance improve as they are exposed to more data over time, and you can have both supervised and unsupervised machine learning. And also you have neural networks that perform beautifully in areas like, for example, analysis of imaging that are encompassing what is called deep learning. I'm going to cover these different areas of improvement of the work in the cath lab with artificial intelligence, but I would like to start by saying that a very important difference between the way that we proceed in conventional statistics as a way of performing research or drawing conclusions and machine learning is that machine learning is data-driven rather than hypothesis-driven. And this explains why the type of correlations that we obtain in this dense data matrix are entirely different. When you perform this, you use much more cluster analysis and other type of analysis different to what is a conventional correlation or regression. This is a research example, a study led by a good friend, Kath Kakuta from Japan, in a consortium in which Spain and South Korea also works. And in this particular case, we use unsupervised machine learning as a research tool to understand what are the specific physiological endotypes in the group of patients who have a low coronary flow reserve and low FFR. And by applying this, actually, we were able to see that there were three distinct physiological endotypes identified on the grounds of demographics, resting and hyperemic coronary flow pressure, and interrogated lesion location that have definitely different outcomes in the long term. So excellent for research in this particular area. But we just saw also one of the studies that was led by Dr. Justin Davis, where the system was trained. That means labels were placed at the specific points of these thousands of tracings, so in such a way that the system could learn about the characteristics of the pressure waveform. And we learned also how this system can be translated to practice, and providing a very important feedback to the physician, which is about the characteristics of the pressure waveform, if it is normal, dampoid, or damped. And this is achieved, of course, with a huge agreement with experts. Now, the role for this is similar to the instruments that are used by pilots in the cockpits of airplanes, where they get informed on circumstances that perhaps have been overlooked, or that are of key importance, of course, by the way that we are conducting in our practice, specifically in the field of our talk, is the area of the way you conduct in the cath lab, where there are many warning signs that perhaps can be, as I say, overlooked or missed. And that, in a way, implies that the way that we interact as operators with the patient in the cath lab is going to be transformed. In the same way that the way of flying an airplane has been transformed by this technology. So the clinician can be performing interactions with the patient, but it's always sort of unidirectional. Now, when you have interposed artificial intelligence, you first get correct instructions in terms of what the physician aims to do over the patient. But at the same time, the physician gets informed on debatable instructions, so he can recheck or reconfirm that some of the actions are correct or that are not a result of overlooking some error. Dr. Justin Davis has already shown us also how these algorithmic systems can contribute to interpretation of complex things like, for example, the pressure pullback curves. And again, it's really important because this generates higher confidence of physicians in a very short time. Now, image interpretation is one of the greatest strengths of artificial intelligence and particularly deep learning. So the classical problem of muffins and chihuahuas, by which in a very short period of time you have to tell if what you saw there on the screen were chihuahuas or muffins, has been already resolved. And there is no doubt that artificial intelligence is much faster in identifying the correct answer than humans. And that's the reason because in the field of our activity in the cath lab, interpretation of intravascular images like IBUS and OCT will be greatly facilitated by this application of deep learning. It is already a reality, and it's something that can, for example, bring detection of the luminal edges to a new standard based on IBUS, but also, of course, can be applied to other imaging techniques. And more importantly, what it does is standardized interpretation, decreasing the risk of human errors and facilitating the adoption of the technique. So you make an expert, a physician in a very short time with the supported counseling of these techniques. When you move to the point of implementing these techniques to improve your stenting, for example, well, we have obviously improved a lot thanks to co-registration of physiology with imaging, which in a way makes now physiology an imaging technique, but still we have a lot of room for improvement. Next thing is that in a single go, you will get full information based on IBUS on the characteristics of the plaque, luminal dimensions, most adequate landing zones. And not only that, by merging this information with data sets coming from large trials, you will be able to have a predictive power in understanding that the segment that you are treating is prone to have restenosis, or that with the luminal achievement that you have obtained, you still may have more possibilities of stent failure in the long term. Now, in the cath lab, we have already good examples of how the analysis of the angiogram can contribute to fulfill many unmet needs. One of them is, of course, dynamic coronary road mapping, which allow us to have the silhouette of the coronary arteries in the vessel while we are manipulated, overlaid on the fluoroscopy screen. And in a dynamic fashion, we can see what is the position of our wire in the coronary tree. But there are much more than that, of course. And like in computed tomography and angiography, we have now the possibility of performing vessel segmentation. There are multiple groups working on this, and it is possible to automatically know that a particular vessel is the LAD, the diagonal, the obtuse marginal, etc. The reason because this is important is not only because of anatomy, it is also because these systems are able to identify the presence of stenosis, calcification, thrombus, dissection, all these very important, relevant aspects of interpretation of the coronary angiogram that can be performed automatically with minimal interaction by the physician and with a very high rate of diagnostic yield. Even the assessment of functional coronary stenosis is now achievable based on artificial intelligence analysis of the coronary angiograms. Now, compared with systems like QFR, for example, that need two orthogonal views to perform three-dimensional reconstruction of the vessel, these systems use a single angiographic view. You can see that the ROC curve to predict the FFR is extremely good. But what is very interesting, again, and highlights the different way of performing of artificial intelligence, is that the data that the algorithm selected for making this judgment as to the physiological significance of the vessel is entirely different to what we will do in something like QFR. So here you have, again, a blend of demographics and clinical data, for example, the body surface area, gender, coronary segment, things that we know that actually do influence coronary physiology due to many studies, are merged in the analysis along with conventional indexes of geometric dimensions of the vessel and the stenosis. Here, there's a list of the many enhanced angiographic systems that we expect to be improved thanks to artificial intelligence. Many of them leading to situations that increase safety, for example, by reducing X-ray exposure in the cath lab. But there is more than that. There is also, there will be radical changes in the way that we interact or we use these devices. And now we are making an effort in bringing to the operator the ability to handle these tools, like, for example, with intrasight. You can see here how in the most contemporary systems, the operator is taking over in terms of making the measurements. But very soon you will have, based on natural language processing algorithms, you will have voice recognition and you will have holographic display. Now, holographic display reduces at a maximum the need of physical interaction. It provides, like in this case, where you have a 3D mapping of the heart in a physiological study, the possibility of performing, interacting with the hologram, in this case using special goggles, and having the possibility, therefore, of not touching any particular button. You will have full control panels in front of you that are holographic displays and that you will select for performing multiple measurements. There will be no need even to use, to wear goggles. This is a different system, real view, that allows simply to have a vision, a holographic vision of the vessel, in which, of course, you merge not only the information obtained by a computed angiography, by CT images, but also by information that you merge with it, like, for example, the model and dimensions of a specific TAVI valve. One of the important aspects is, of course, to merge this information for precision medicine, or for very accurate and precise interventions in the cath lab. One of the ways of bringing this is merging what we have discussed so far with robotic technology. This is an example of already existing system of robotic PCI, where, as you can see, the operator is standing outside the cath lab and is performing, contrast injections, manipulation of wires, etc., with minimal exposure to radiation. Now, you can imagine or envisage that holographic display, the automatic detection of structures located under the skin, will facilitate vascular access, will facilitate very high accurate interventions. All of these, of course, is supported by systems that minimize human error. And finally, we have also to remember that the power of artificial intelligence refers to the analysis of the environment. And from that, I mean that the installment of cameras in the cath lab will allow the possibility of understanding if the patient arrives to the cath lab, is on the table, if the physician starts the procedure. All these will be merged with information coming from different sources, including the angiogram, including the polygraph. And by doing that, it will be possible to have a fantastic automatic reporting of procedures, improving outcomes. You will have identification of problems from the very beginning, and will, in summary, improve enormously the efficiency of the team in the cath lab. I think that all this is obviously very exciting. I have to emphasize again that one of the interesting aspects of AI is that you incorporate data that you are acquiring with the data that is pre-existing about the medical history of the patient, but also large patient series. And I'm positive that all these will eventually lead, very soon, lead to better stratification of patients, better planning of interventions, to increase the precision of our procedures, to predict the final results of our interventions, to have procedural assistance and warning systems in the cath lab, to decrease inter and intra-operator variability, and to time saving and improved cath lab workflow. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Prof. Again, very, very exciting lecture that you just gave. We are quite limited by time, so I'm going to do a quick summary. Then I'm going to go around to everyone to ask you on your opinion or your wish about what AI should be in the future, or what you think it should be in the future for cardiologists. So for Eleanor Lopez, who said that she's worried for the job for sonographers. Once what Jasper presented about AI taking over echo reading is affected. But I will say this, I think what Jasper's point is quite true. AI might take over the tedious task. Anyway, no one wants to do much. So if you think you're doing a tedious job now, maybe AI can help with that so that you're closer and bring your productivity up. I mean, the analogy is maybe 200 years ago, there are coolies carrying on cargo off the boats. Now you have huge container being lifted off at one shot. Instead of carrying the load one by one, maybe you are the crane operator. So I think AI may help productivity. It may help bring us closer to what Justin talked about. If you're not so skilled, it brings your standard up to the median of the experts. Although I think because it's a median, maybe ultra-performing experts like Dr. Wasari could outperform an AI machine. But I think what we are trying to do is to bring up the median for all practitioners. The other thing is what Justin said that I picked up was that we do need to adjust, and that I think we need to change our mindset to learn and welcome AI rather than resist it as much as we can. So I think we all need to find out a little bit. We may not be experts in AI, but knowing a little bit about it does help us take a very valid angle towards AI. So now I'm just going to go around in the last 3 minutes of this session to KK first. Maybe you would like to share with us your thoughts about the future of AI, whether it's there, what it should look like for us in Asia Pacific.
Well, I think the AI is really here. The two big drivers for AI are data and processing power. And I think processing power we have, data is what we need, and good quality data. So I think as a community, we should work towards building sources of good data so that we can drive some of these technologies and implement it in our communities.
That's a very big topic by itself, ownership of data. Now that we know data is the new oil. So that's a big topic by itself. I'm not going to go into that. So very good, KK. More data, more good data. Logan, what is your wish for AI in the future?
So I think it's my vision for AI in the future is actually a combination of what these talks were. It's implementing it and using it. We are fed with a lot of data, as KK mentioned, but the data that we are fed nowadays are in two ways. One is doctors are getting a larger and larger burden of patients as we work towards preventative medicine. We don't just wait for the MI to occur, we try to prevent things. So we have a larger awareness of prevention. So larger number of patients, busier workload. But on top of that, for each patient now, as we do more and more tests and we are more and more aware, we have a larger number of data points per patient. So all this heavy lifting, just like the cranes that you mentioned, should be done by AI. Our job as a doctor is to execute judgment based on clinical experience and to do the human touch in terms of empathy. So that's where I see us working, actually. So we can focus more on that.
So again, I think that's a very good point. We have enough data. Even now, to put it together in terms of preventive measure, we are doing very poorly at. So prevention and bringing forward up the upstream, the treatment. So Dr. Warisawa, maybe your thoughts about the future for AI in Japan, maybe?
Thank you. I totally agree with that. AI can help improve the quality of medical service or procedure or decision making in the cath lab by non-expert cardiologists. My question is, I have two questions. Can AI improve the procedure or decision making by expert interventional cardiologists? This is the first question in the future. And the second question is that AI can detect the known disease very efficiently. But my second question is, can AI detect or recognize or discover new disease which is unknown, which is not known in the future?
So maybe I can't answer all your questions. The first question, I think it definitely can improve decision making even for experts, especially when you talk about repetition, you talk about fatigue. It does point out, like what Justin demonstrated, certain pitfalls. I'll defer your second question to the rest of the panel. Jasper first, followed by Prof. Javier. Jasper, maybe you want to chip into the question as well as your thoughts about the future.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the point that Dr. Warisawa was making is a really important one. I think that I'm convinced that actually we will learn about new diseases, or depends, of course, on the definition of disease. But the example that I provided, and it is just an example, because there are many pieces of research in that direction of identifying specific endotypes or identifying a specific type of patient profiles that escape our attention because we were not able to perform that degree of scrutiny is really going to be really, really important. I think that's something that would be a big question mark in the future, is that many of these information that you obtain about clustering refers to a specific population that you have used in that particular research. And the question remains as to whether it will be applicable to the overall universe of patients. But I think that will be the type of evolution of this type of research that will require a specific validation or transfer of this to a wider group of patients.
So I think what Professor Javier said, if I read him correctly, is that AI with huge data points can point you to something that you've not seen and possibly really point you to a direction of new disease patterns. So Jasper, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think those points are very well taken. I think the other possibility of AI finding new diseases in the field of genetics or more on the pathophysiological level, where I think nowadays AI is also used to actually find new treatment targets or protein structures or even new genes involved in disease. So I think, with regard to finding new diseases, that's going to be a very interesting space to watch. Secondly, for the future of AI, I believe that the field of what we call explainability, so sort of the ability of the algorithm to actually explain itself in an individual patient case, is going to take a huge flight. And I think it's going to really help also the practicing physician to sort of have trust and faith in the AI, because it actually knows why it's saying turn left when it's saying turn left on Google Maps, and not just saying, telling you to turn left without giving any explanation. So I think that's going to be really in the near future.
Yeah, thanks, Jasper. That's exciting to know. So for the last word, we'll have Professor Justin Davis to maybe sum up his thoughts for AI in the future. You're muted, Justin. Sorry.
Thanks, Jack. Sorry. So
AI needs to do that for you. Yeah, next time.
It will. But you strangely say that, but Zoom actually, when you start talking, it says that you're muted. So it's, starting to. There was a great web chat I saw with Jack Ma and Elon Musk in China talking about this. And, Elon Musk has been right about a lot of things. And I think one of the things which he's, really pushing is that the AI is really going to impact many areas of our daily life, as it's doing already. And it's going to impact many levels of our professional life as physicians. And I think that it will mean change, as these things always do. And as you gave that great description around the docs and moving boxes around. And it will mean that we do things in slightly different ways. But ultimately, I think that we're going to move to a situation where we do things probably more efficiently at a better cost, but also most importantly with increasing and maintaining those the standards as high as we can possibly get them. And I think if we're able to do that, I think that there's an overall win for patients. But Jack, you know, this is a transformation not just in medicine, it's going through all of society. And I think the questions which people are concerned about, the panelists here about, you gave the example of the sonographer, they really transcend all of society in terms of, you know, how the jobs will work in the future compared to how they do now. And, you know, these are bigger questions like living wages and so on and so forth. And, you know, but I don't think that should be the stop for us going forward with these technologies. I don't think anything will stop it. It just means that we need to think as a society level how they kind of fit in to make sure that we can all have, you know, comfortable, good lives that we want to lead. Thanks,
Justin. That's a beautiful finish. We may not be as close to Skynet and Terminator as we think we are, but if it does, I welcome the future as well. Maybe humans are not meant for the planet Earth. But okay, so I really enjoyed myself in this session. I learned a lot from my expert panel and speakers. It is something that, as cardiologists, this is a great session sponsored by Philips in conjunction with APSC JCS. And it primes us to the fact that we need to change our mindset and be more embracing of what is to come in AI. So with that, I would like to thank my panelists and my speakers, and welcome everyone to join us for our next session in our APSC consensus statement on TCAGLA use that a little bit more back to the basics. Thanks a lot, guys, and keep safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.